Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. We're happy to be here at MIT. My name is John Podesta. I'm the founder of the Center for American Progress and one of the co-chairs on this U.S.-India Track 2 dialogue that we're going to talk about. We've been meeting here at MIT for the last couple of days. This is a dialogue that's been going on. We call it a Track 2, and I'm going to explain that. This has been a dialogue that's been going on since 2009 and has taken place during the change of administration in India and a change of administration in the United States. Track 2 is a fancy way of saying none of us serve in government right now. So we all have at one time or another either been advisors, formal or informal, to the governments of the United States, the governments of India, and at the subnational level, to advisors to governors, to mayors, et cetera. And the purpose of having the dialogue is to be able, in a more candid way, to discuss the issues that are in common between our two countries on climate and energy and those which separate us, and to try to find a path forward and to give advice to policymakers, both in the executive branches and in Parliament. It has been our tradition to meet in Washington, D.C., or to meet in Delhi, and we decided this year that we would meet in Boston, partly because of the resources that MIT has, and Secretary Moniz, and distinguished professor at MIT, Ernie Moniz, hosted us here for this set of meetings. But we also wanted to come to a place where there was a lot of action going on, and action in a positive way to move forward on the trajectory of a transition to a clean energy economy. So last evening we heard from Carl Spector, who's the Commissioner of the Environment for the City of Boston. We just had a terrific session with Senator Ed Markey about his view about what the opportunities are, even in this Congress, and certainly building towards the next Congress. The last 2 years, I probably don't need to remind the people in this room, I think you're probably knowledgeable, have brought the deadliest hurricane in a century to the United States, the heaviest downpours ever recorded, the worst wildfire season ever in California. In Kerala, India saw its worst floods in 100 years, and we've just seen recently reports on the front pages of the U.S. Newspapers, the unhealthy air that is in Delhi, making headlines around the world. The U.S. and India, I think, have a shared and vital interest in combating global climate change. They were cooperative in producing the Paris Agreement. Scientific studies have shown time and again that our two countries stand to see some of the worst economic, environmental, and social damages as a result of unmitigated climate change. We also have some of the best research institutions in the world that can begin to do the kind of deep research that it's going to take to develop the technologies that can provide that kind of transition. And of course, we're the oldest and the world's largest democracy, and at a time of global authoritarianism, our cooperation on the world stage is more vital than ever. So that was the context in which we got together here in Boston over these last 2 days. We talked about a range of shared interests and the importance of trying to tackle problems together, including reducing air pollution, reducing short-lived climate pollutants, some of which I refer to as super pollutants like hydrofluorocarbons, black carbon, methane reductions. And we talked a fair amount about finding zero-emission transportation solutions. And then how do we actually finance to produce that, what many people estimate as $1 trillion annual new financing into clean energy and adaptation. In the United States, again, I will reflect my view, although we have a bipartisan group here. We have something of dysfunction, as is apparent from the fact that we can't even have the government go to work. In Washington, D.C., it's creating, I think, serious headwinds for bilateral cooperation as well as multilateral cooperation on a whole host of issues, but including these. As you all know, the Trump administration announced its intention to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accords. I think what's less well known is that the administration has so far declined to send an important global agreement that the U.S. and India had a significant degree of effort and cooperation and produced a multilateral agreement to phase down superpolluting hydrofluorocarbons, which is referred to as the Kigali Agreement to the Montreal Protocol. That was made, as I said, possible because of the determined effort by both governments at the most senior level, by President Obama and Prime Minister Modi. If its targets are fully realized, the world could avoid a 0.5 degree of global warming by mid-century. Right now, that's stuck because the administration has chosen not to send it forward to the United States Senate, where it actually enjoys bipartisan support, and Senate Republican leaders have asked the president to move that forward. Let me introduce my colleagues, and then I'm going to just throw a few questions to them, and I'm going to have plenty of time to open it up to questions from the audience. First, I want to introduce my dialogue co-chairs. In the center of our panel is Jamshyd Godrej, the chairman of the Ananta Center and managing director, which is a major think tank in India that's dedicated to environmental solutions and tackling the problems of climate change. He's also the managing director of Godrej and Boyce Manufacturing Company Limited. Next to him, you will recognize Bill Reilly, who served as the EPA administrator for President George H.W. Bush, had served previously in Republican administrations, been a stalwart champion of the environment, both in the NGO sector and in the private sector. Next to me is Dr. Anil Kakodkar. He's the president of the National Academy of Sciences of India and chairman of the Rajiv Gandhi Science and Technology Commission. Next to Jamshyd is Kelly Sims Gallagher, professor of energy and environmental policy at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Next to Kelly is Arunabha Ghosh, the CEO of Council of Energy, Environment, and Water, a leading think tank in India. And next to him is Andy Karsner, who served as an assistant secretary of energy in the Bush administration, is now a managing partner at the Emerson Collective. Jamshyd, I mentioned the Kigali Amendment and the need to come up with cleaner cooling agents to be used across the world. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about what's going on in India, the importance of that issue, how the Indian government is approaching trying to deal with the provision of cooling and the need to do so in a more environmentally sound way.
Thank you, John. Well, I think you all know that the average temperature of India is normally very hot. And so the demand for both refrigeration and air conditioning is very high. And the penetration, after 50 years of independence, the penetration of home refrigerators is still only less than 20% of households. And the penetration of air conditioners for home cooling is less than 1% of households. So there is a huge, potential as incomes increase in India for increase in refrigeration and air conditioning. And I think that the realization that once the Montreal Protocol was done, and which was basically about at that time Freon, but the HFCs also, which are the next generation of CFCs, are extremely bad from a climate perspective, and they do last a long time. And so I think a number of companies, including my company, which makes refrigerators and air conditioners, have been working on this problem for a long time. The government of India actually worked on an energy star rating program. We had a lot of support from ClimateWorks Foundation and other organizations at that time who had the experience of the star rating system. We have implemented a star rating system for air conditioners and refrigerators in India, other products also, but these were the key ones. And the public adoption of the 5-star refrigerator or the 5-star air conditioner has been very high. I think what has happened over the years is this program has been there for more than 5 years now. And what has happened is that there is a public awareness now about energy efficiency through that program. And so I think that has driven to a large extent. One good thing about Indian households is that they are quite small, which means that their refrigerators also have to be quite small, their air conditioners have to be small. So I think the potential for energy efficiency is very high because these small ones tend, you can get their efficiency up. The other thing that we worked on is the CFC problem. And many, many years ago, we worked with the Swiss government and the German government and other multilateral organizations to work on alternatives. And I'm happy to say that my company has made more than 20 million appliances using non-CFC and non-HFC gases. And these are all based on propane and propane derivatives. And the amazing thing about it is that you actually get better efficiency from it. The downside, of course, is that propane is an inflammable material. And the question is, how do you manage it? Are the concentrations of propane so high that it could be a risk or not? That's really where the technology and the usage pattern come in. And the government of India, I think, have understood this issue quite well. But I think, like governments in the U.S. and India, I think there has been this issue of reciprocity also, in the sense that we have not technically signed the Kigali Agreement, but we have signed it. So from the government's perspective, we have signed it. As it was pointed out, it's not on the UN, on the list of there. But the point is that we are working right now on a national cooling action plan. And this cooling action plan will take into account all these things. It will take into account insulation issues, it'll take into account energy efficiency, the refrigerant. And the next level that we are trying to promote is that we should get away from compressors completely and go into, I think all of you should know that, there's the Peltier effect chip that was, discovered many, maybe a century ago, but very little has been done to make it efficient. And so thermochips now can be used to make refrigerators and freezers up to a particular size. I think that a lot of work is being done in it, and you will see, I think, over the next 4, 5, 10 years, that there will be a shift away from compressors into other types of cooling opportunities. And I think the Kigali Agreement helps in being able to not just raise awareness on it, but also to actually provide some solutions.
Just to underscore what Jamshyd said, the group as a whole, U.S. and Indian side, agreed to go forward with recommendations to both encourage the administration to send up the articles of ratification to the United States Senate, to encourage states that are undertaking phase-down efforts of HFCs, including California and other states that are well along on that program, and to encourage the Congress to develop implementing legislation to be in compliance with Kigali. Let's turn a little bit to politics, Bill. You worked for 2 Republican administrations that passed strong environmental legislation on a strong bipartisan basis. And at the time, you had strong bipartisan leadership on the environment. We obviously have seen the Trump administration pull back from that. But what about Congress? Is there a chance that we can see new Republican leadership emerge to take up the mantle of environmental protection? Are you optimistic about that?
Wow. I'm an optimist, but I don't know if I'd go that far. I think that
Particularly on the issue of climate change.
the reality with respect to climate change is that a large number of Republican senators, and as one put it to me, at least 100 Republican members of the House, are fully conversant with the science of climate change. They get it. They know that the Earth is changing, our climate is changing, and that humans have contributed significantly to this, as the scientific community has claimed for 25 years. They're fearful, however, that were they to take a public position, they would put their seats at risk to right-wing primary science deniers, of whom there are a good many, particularly in the base, as it's called, of the Republican Party, the base which is so important also to the election and continued success of President Trump. I think reality is that there are ways that one can approach issues that involve adapting to climate change and preparing for it without necessarily acceding to or saying that it's because of climate change. And we have seen that demonstrated at the state and local level throughout the United States in any number of initiatives, whether it's required renewable contribution electrically in some 30 states. I was particularly admiring of Mayor Daley in Chicago in 1996, who without any attempt to characterize the causes of climate change, merely consulted his university professors, scientific community in Chicago, and asked what's the likelihood of a future that is as warm as the scientists are predicting, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and so forth. And they developed a whole suite of responses. They planted different trees, 2,200 trees in their parks every year, permeable pavements, roofs that reflect, and responses even to the point of increasing by threefold their emergency rooms because of heat stroke, which was expected to be much more significant when they have 3 times the number of days above 95 degrees in the summertime. I think that things are happening in the United States. Whether the Congress can get over some of them and support what in fact is adaptation in places where there are Republican office holders who are seeing that their beaches are being eroded, their houses and frontline coastal buildings affected, and their streets flooding. I speak particularly of Miami Beach, but the Carolinas and Virginia are certainly right up there, and so is Alaska. These people have Republican representatives, and I think that they're going to want to have some kind of response to these problems in which the federal government is engaged. To that extent, at least, I guess I'm confident that if some kind of modicum of proposal can come out of the House, which they could embrace without abandoning their base or the president, I think that many of them probably will. I certainly hope so.
Dr. Kakodkar, let me ask you a 2-part question. We're here at MIT. We heard from a number of professors at MIT who are working specifically out of the Tata Energy and Climate Center on problems ranging from reducing agricultural burning to reducing air pollution to mapping ocean currents in the Indian Ocean. There are many graduate students and undergraduate students who are really interested in tackling this problem. How would you think about that from the perspective of Indian graduate students? And then what do you think the state of collaboration, cooperation is between Indian scientists and American scientists at this point on this set of questions?
Well, first of all, let me say that as far as India is concerned, the need for sustainable sources of energy and the need for making sure that they are climate friendly, actually these two demands point out to the same solution. in terms of the resources that one can get from over Indian landmass. This, of course, requires a lot of research, and I think there was some years back there was a wonderful Indo-U.S. program on different aspects of energy, but it had a big research component, PSR, and it did a lot of work on photovoltaics, solar thermal, in which the academia in US, academia in India, industry in US, industry in India, they are all working together. Unfortunately, that program duration is over, and I don't see the continuity of that. But that experience has actually showed that there is a huge opportunity for joint collaboration. Even the Tata Center here at MIT, and there is a very similar center, again funded by Tatas at IIT Bombay and a few other institutions in India. They are all centers devoted to carrying out research for driving technology for the local development, national development. In fact, at one stage, these centers were called frugal engineering centers, low-cost technologies, and low-cost, but technologies which are of course high-tech. And there are several areas there. Talking in energy sense, currently there is a huge emphasis in India on deriving biofuels out of the biomass, both the surplus agricultural residue as well as other forms of biomass derived from forests or other sources. There are as many as a dozen biorefineries. They are being set up currently. And that is on the basis of the development which has taken place. I think one of the technologies has been developed at the Institute for Chemical Technology in Mumbai, which is a very reputed institution in chemical engineering. There is another development which has taken place in an industry in India, Praj. And both these technologies are kind of at the core of these 12 plants. We had recently a meeting where we had a lot of participation and several US groups were there. And I noticed at least half a dozen another set of technologies which also can be deployed, because one could get this, and I think diversity of technologies is very crucial in this area, because you need, it's not as if any kind of biomass, although you are talking about technologies which are biomass agnostics, but still there are specific features and you require specific technologies to handle them. And I think that's an area of tremendous potential where the research groups in both countries, the industry on both countries can come together. And there are many other areas. For example, solar thermal, I would say, is another area. And by the way, the biomass potential, just the surplus agricultural residue, has been identified as having enough potential to in fact displace entire gasoline that is used in India. So we are not talking about small potentials. You need technologies to address the problems, additional problems that may be there. You also need technologies to make them somewhat more price competitive. At the moment, these technologies are being deployed, but there is a need for a degree of subsidy. So there are, I think, several challenges which can be handled together. And I think it's an area of great cooperation.
Great. Doctor mentioned the PACE-R program, and I just want to point out one of our participants in the dialogue is our former U.S. ambassador to India, and who is with us today, Rich Verma, and he was very instrumental in making sure that program got going and stayed on track, so I want to thank him for that. Kelly, let me turn to you. You were just in Katowice, Poland for the U.S. Conference of Parties on the Framework Convention. And give us a sense of what it means that the U.S. is there, they're participating, but yes, they've said we're pulling out of Paris. What was it like there? And what does it mean for the rest of the world that the administration's announced that even though that won't be executed till after the election in 2020, that they intend to pull out of Paris?
Yeah, it's sort of a bizarre state of affairs, and it's frankly strange to be at the international climate negotiations because the U.S. is still there. We're still actually part of the Paris Agreement. We're still parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the U.S. was actively negotiating and in some ways was very constructive, helped to negotiate a kind of landing zone on transparency for the rule book that was agreed upon in Katowice. But on the other hand, there were some things that were really unconstructive, like the United States saying that they didn't want to welcome the most recent IPCC report. That's not helpful. It's kind of demoralizing for scientists. But I think in general, my sense is, you know, if before Paris we were all in sort of this, on a bike ride together, and we were getting kind of excited, and some countries were starting to pedal really fast and sort of compete with each other to see who could do, you know, even better. And there was this virtuous cycle that was starting to emerge, you know, with some countries saying, you know, we can do this, and we want to step up and try this, and we can maybe do better than you. What it feels like now is that the world has kind of gone into coast. They've stopped pedaling as fast as they were. Some countries are steadily pedaling, you know, but the urge, the motivation, the excitement, that sort of race and ambition is sort of, the momentum has slowed. That being said, I think it's really important to understand that the global negotiators did actually reach agreement on this rule book for the Paris Agreement. So we now can operationalize and begin, you know, the very important task of implementation. And I think one of the things we talked a lot about in this dialogue was how important it was to move forward with just concrete, you know, whether or not the U.S. stays in Paris or not, there's so much implementation that can make the U.S. effectively implement the Paris Agreement, and likewise India as well.
We'll come back to what's happening in states and cities on that point. But I also want to note that Kelly was in the administration at the Office of Science and Technology Policy and was extremely involved with and helped produce the joint statement that the U.S. and China did in that really sparked momentum towards Paris. I want to thank you for that. Arunabha, I mentioned that we spent a lot of time talking about air pollution and the way U.S. and India could cooperate to deal with the air pollution problem in India. Just to put this in context, the WHO has noted that 11 of the 12 most polluted cities in the world are now in India. I don't think that was a record to move beyond China that India sought, but that's where we are. And I'm wondering, there's a lot of public awareness of the air pollution issues, but what's it going to take, and what does India need to move from awareness to action? The government's recently put out a program, but how do you see moving forward the ability of the Indian authorities to get on top of the air pollution problem in India?
Thanks, John. let me start answering that question with a story from China. In 2013, China hosted the APEC summit. And I happened to be in Beijing exactly at that time. Now, when I landed in preparation for the summit, the factories and the power plants around Beijing and the neighboring provinces had been shut down. So I took a photograph, very scientific experiment, of the sky, which was blue. And then a week later, I was headed out. The summit had ended. President Obama had left. The power plants were up again. And I took a photograph from the same spot, and the sky was gray. Now, that very, very scientific, unscientific experiment of mine was endorsed by China Daily, the English newspaper that I read daily. And they had an editorial which said, make hashtag, hashtags were very new at the time, make hashtag APEC Blue permanent. Now, why I say this is the story around trying to tackle air pollution in Beijing and China in general began about a decade ago, just around the time they were hosting the Olympics. And that first attempt failed. And then came a second attempt around 2011 or so, that failed. And then came this 2013 story. By that time, the public attitude around it had completely changed. And after that, China launched its so-called war on pollution. Right? So this 5-year reduction in air pollution there is actually a 10-year story. Now, if I now come to India, I'm one of the unfortunate souls responsible for air quality in the National Capital Region. We have to actually think about this from two perspectives. One, how do we keep it in the news cycle right through the year? Because if everyone adopts my very unscientific approach to looking at the skies, it drops off the news cycle. Because the skies turn really bad only after around October and stay bad till about January. And then people look up into the skies, oh, it's blue, it should be okay. But actually, it's bad all year round. It's just a question of how bad it gets. Right? So how you use information to inform the public that in one time of the year, it could be agricultural crop residue burning. Another time of the year, it could be transportation. A third time of the year, it could be industrial use, et cetera. So you've got to keep it in the news cycle and make it personal. Well, one of the things we're trying to do right now is this is school admission season. So we're trying to inform parents that depending on where you send your children or depending on what you choose to be the school for your children, this is going to be the air quality. Just a few kilometers apart. But the other thing that we have to do is get more information, but in a democratic way. So, of course, we need a lot more sensors, high-quality sensors run by the Central Pollution Control Board all across the country, not just in Delhi. But what we also need are thousands of reasonably decent, low-cost air quality monitors that can drive citizen awareness. There's one hooked up outside of my own balcony in my apartment. We've deployed 54 of them in villages in Punjab where the crop burning happens. We are deploying them near industrial smokestacks. So that democratized approach to information, combined with keeping it in the news cycle, would create our version of that make APEC Blue permanent. If that doesn't happen, the government will always find an excuse not to act.
We discussed in the dialogue ways to support a citizen science movement really in India to take that on and talk to Rob Stoner, who's the head of the Tata Center and deputy director of the MIT Energy Initiative, about how MIT might participate in that. Andy, I mentioned the subnational level. You live in California as part of the Emerson Collective. You work globally, but you're based in probably ground zero of attempts at the subnational level to try to meet the Paris obligation that President Obama made. How would you assess and judge what's happening in Massachusetts, in California, and state of Washington, across the country, the Reggie states, in cities across the country? Give us a little sense of how much action there is and what does it amount to against federal government that's sort of pulled back.
Yeah. Thanks, John, and thanks for your leadership and the chair's leadership in this dialogue. Leadership, like nature, abhors a vacuum. And so that vacuum has got to get filled. And so to some degree, there has been a useful catalysis of activism from the bottom up that has generated in ways that Americans have found their de Tocquevillian muscles and really leaned into the idea of taking action where they are, who they associate with, and whatever platform or jurisdiction they live in. And I guess I would group that into 3 or 4 ways when we talk about subnationals. It's easiest, subnationals feels like a very technical climate negotiating type term, but it's really, if it's not the federal government, then who? Is it the states, the localities? Is it business and NGOs, universities, great universities like MIT with its leading climate action plan? All of these participants play a role, and I feel like so many of them have doubled down on the urgency by giving themselves time-based metrics and actual volumetric measurements in ways that everybody's sort of come together and put it in the pot and says, does that all amount to what we should be doing as a country? And we recently had a lot of this group hosted in San Francisco at the Global Climate Action Summit and kind of compiled this. Mayor Bloomberg has been an extraordinary leader in the C40. And they're all sort of commendable. I can think of a few different examples out of almost every category. I mean, from big things like Plan NYC or what we heard from Boston last night and its ambitions to very small towns like Stockton, California, where Mayor Tubbs is deeply working on bringing green-cooled world-class data centers to revive economic green opportunity engines and at the same time measure the greenhouse gas reductions. On the state level, we've had the opportunity in California during the hiatus in Washington to be very aggressive and very assertive in legislation. In these last 2 terms alone, the President Pro Tem, Kevin De Leon, put together a bipartisan coalition, something you don't hear out of Washington at all, but the leader of the House Assembly, Chad Mayes, joined him with about a third of the Republican caucus to pass what I think is the most effectively implemented cap and trade and carbon pricing regime on earth today. Not only because it's operational and it's working and it's gathering billions of dollars, but because it was designed in its architecture to reinvest transparently in communities and communities of lower income with the California Environment Screen. So people begin to feel the real benefit, and most importantly, people who have been left out and who are hit worst and first by these wildfires and by these temperature rises are actually knowing and feeling the government's doing something that it has legitimacy around. This last year, something people didn't think could be done at all, right as the summit commenced. California matched Hawaii's 10-year head start in having an actionable stretch goal for a zero-emission economy. Now, everybody thought, well, that's just Hawaii. It's in the middle of the Pacific. It's oil. It's easy. It's an island. That's an interesting showcase. But when the 6th largest economy on Earth puts together a technology-neutral clean energy standard and said we will be zero emission by date certain and defines the outcome rather than the interest groups on the way in, it's a consequential model that's now going to be replicated across many states. And so that template begins to proliferate and take hold, but not from Washington. I just add on the corporate side, and maybe I have a small bias towards Apple and Lisa and the good work there, but Google and other tech leaders are 100% procuring green and demanding efficiency standards ahead of what the government would do because it's good for business and it's good for their stability of operations and everything else. So those revolutions are being kind of led from the ground up. And then as everybody knows on this campus, in terms of the universities in the cutting edge, I mean, we do a lot with MIT at the nexus of nature and technology, natural capital. And we've got odd coalitions like MIT and Walmart and Conservation International trying to find traceability and use the blockchain and digital ledgers and accounting systems to understand how they can incorporate the externalities of coral reefs and of fish in natural capital for Walmart's procurement methods. So again, we don't have an agency set up in Washington that can move that fast and that robustly in the research. So there's been this sort of resurgent bottom-up feeling about the vacuum. But I would say that 1,000 beautiful yachts is not tantamount to a flagship aircraft carrier. And there is a need for real leadership and for that vacuum to be filled. Back to sort of Bill's early commentary. When I lived in Asia, my favorite annual sport, was once a year of consequence, was dragon boat. And I was nobody in dragon boat. I was one hand on the side of the boat and tried to get it right and enjoyed the festivals afterwards, et cetera. But the most important person in any good dragon boat is the drummer. It's not anybody with the oar, it's the drummer. How much can you get people coordinated in a common pace, in a common direction, to a common destination at the fastest possible pace? And we in this country are missing the drummer. We're sort of looking around the base for the drummer, and not just on the right, also on the left. And the thing about a base is, and in this particular presidency, debase, the thing about a base is there's no glory in the base. You're only after stability. Everybody actually knows that the glory is at the peak. It's not in the base. It's the ability to branch out, engage, activate, have a pinnacle of ideas, and get things done. So we are missing not only ideas, we're missing a competition of ideas. We're missing a reconciliation, collaboration of ideas of the type we've had in this engagement with our Indian friends. And we need that to be modeled in Washington so that we can really take advantage of all the excitement that's built from the bottom up.
Very well said. I'm going to open this up, actually, let you ask questions, but I'm going to put my panelists on notice that before we end, I'm going to ask them to give me one idea they're most excited about to basically solve the climate crisis. So you should be thinking about that, but let me open it up. Just please raise your hand. Gentleman in the back. Here, why don't you use the mic?
Hi there. Hi, I'm with the MIT Energy Initiative. We have a study called the Mobility of the Future Study. As a transportation engineer, I have a question for the Indian members of the panel. What can India do to prepare for a rise in GDP per capita, which will result in a rise in rate of motorization in India? The problem with transportation is that as more people use it, things get worse in terms of quality of service for everyone.
Okay. So yes, I think you're absolutely right that as the GDP grows, you see today the motorization in the major cities has really grown tremendously. I think the approach that we're trying to take now is to change the dialogue in terms of public transport. I think we know that, for instance, in India, a very large amount of transport, even in cities, is done by walking and by cycling. But three-wheelers, for instance, wherever they are available in the major cities, is also a big form of transport for people. For the common people. And trains, like if you take Bombay, the mainstay has been trains. And Bombay, the geography of Bombay, it's north-south, and the trains run, north-south, more or less, one east, one west. And the majority of commuter traffic has been managed by trains, which have been electric, since forever. But I think what has happened is that because, as you say, income levels increase, there's been greater demand for private transportation. And the main reason for that is because the quality of public transport, has not been able to keep pace. So people, most people going to an office, etc., will not use the public transport. And the amazing thing in Bombay is that we had a very, very good bus system, the BEST. And the BEST bus system, over a 10-year period, their ridership has halved, only because the quality of the ride has been so poor, not because of affordability or cost or anything like that. So I think the issue of private transport is coming. I think what we're going to push more and more is the internet-based cab services. I think those are going to be the big drivers. Because the traditional taxi in Bombay and in other parts never kept up. The quality of the vehicles were very poor. Many of them were 30-year-old vehicles. We used to make something called a Premier Padmini, if you've ever heard of that. But if these are now 30 years old, and if you sit in the back seat of that, you can actually see the road through the floor. So the quality has to change there, and it will only change through public transport. And I think that as we're also talking about electrification, my personal view is that we must move faster in public transport on electrification, because that's where you'll get the maximum number of passenger miles traveled. And get the private vehicles essentially to move to the next level of fuel efficiency, which is India has announced that we will skip one generation and go to BS6 for the tailpipe pollution within the next couple of years. So all the vehicle manufacturers have to re-engineer their vehicles. So that will help in air quality. But at the same time, I think what we have to do is the only way we're going to reduce private transport is by making better public transport available.
Neil, do you want to add to that?
Well, I entirely agree with everything that Jamshyd said. But there is something which requires a fundamental correction. You mentioned about the most polluted cities in the world, or maximum number in India. If you look at the growth, the mid-sized cities and the rate of growth of these mid-sized cities, this apparently is fastest for Indian mid-sized cities. Now, that urbanization would take place, that you cannot avoid it, it's given. And then we must prepare for that. But I don't think India has to have the distinction of the fastest growing cities. I think we need to concentrate also on the rural side. And there are needs, demands on the rural side. And that also has to get into the planning process. And I think even there, the improvement in the transport is very important. So, in fact, I mentioned this in the meeting. I was involved in a technology vision report that we prepared for India. And in the transportation segment, we have put targets like anybody should be able to reach district capital in less than 2 to 3 hours. Anybody should be able to reach state capital in less than 5 hours. Anybody should be able to reach national capital in less than 8 hours. And in cities, one should be able to go from place A to place B in less than 1 hour, and design the entire transportation system, whether it is cities or villages or whatever, to meet such a requirement. And I think that should make some difference.
Well, I think
just one point I wanted to make, because if we need to become mobility engineers rather than just sort of transport system engineers. And the problem we have is that our last mile connectivity is poor. We've got 10 cities in India right now with metro railway, 15 other cities are building metro railway, many more will come on stream. But the point is, those are great modern carriages, right? They'll be better than the T here. But once you get to your station, from there, the last 2 kilometers in a hot country, you don't want to walk. That last 2 kilometers, if you don't fix it, what you're doing is you're nudging that same commuter to a private vehicle for the entire 15-kilometer journey, because you're not fixing 2 kilometers. That's the design problem.
yeah. Got a mic?
I came a bit late, so I apologize if you already discussed this. The Global Carbon Project reported a few months ago that India's greenhouse gas emissions had gone up 6.7% in the previous year, more than China, more than the U.S. I was curious to get your insights on what can be done to bend that curve. And from the U.S. perspective, are there lessons that are helpful for India from our experience, both good and bad?
Arunabha?
So we are just over 2 gigatons of emissions, right? So significantly lower than US or China. and per capita terms, very low. So but I don't want to make that argument. Let's look at the wedges, right? Number one, decarbonization has to happen in the power sector, right? Where, unlike China, which waited till it built out 900 gigawatts of coal and then got onto the renewable story, we decided to put a target of 175 gigawatts of renewables when at that time, the entire electricity system was just 300 gigawatts. Right? So it's a massive push. What we are trying to do in 7 to 10 years, it took Germany 2 decades to achieve. Right? So at the margin, renewables is beating coal already. What's going to be the next big wedge? And that's partially my answer also to John's question, answer his exam question, is industrial heat. Right? How do we make steel using the cleanest fuels possible? Right? Because you can't put a solar panel on top of a steel factory or a cement plant. So what you need is alternative fuels which are lower carbon. So refuse-derived fuels, for instance, can substitute for coal in the cement sector. The Indian cement sector is already the world's most energy efficient. But it is an urbanizing country, so we're going to keep making more and more cement. So can we substitute refuse-derived fuel for coal? Can we split water using renewables and use the hydrogen as a substitute for coal in making steel? That's going to be the next big wedge. Then comes transportation. So I think what happens is in climate negotiations, we keep thinking about when is our peaking year, right? Whereas I would ask the question alternatively, well, what is an alternative way to grow, right? Which does not compromise my industrial growth strategy, does not compromise my job story. And that's where, again, technology and design comes in very much front and center. And we of course need some policy signals, we need more innovative financing, but those are my sort of, where I would look, those are the new, interesting, exciting spaces beyond solar and wind.
Kelly, you want to take a crack at the American experience to be able to help guide this?
Well, sure. I mean, I think I'll pick up right where Arunabha left off, because I think, you can look at the American experience, you can look at the Chinese experience, and in many ways, we went through this traditional growth model, right, where we decided we were going to develop first and then clean up our act afterwards. And I think what's really exciting about what's happening in India and now happening in China is trying to find a new growth model. And we shouldn't expect that this is going to be easy. I think this is our fundamental challenge. How are we going to find ways to grow and create good, significant, real jobs for people in a way that does not ruin the environment? And I think India is just going up right now. It's just starting up this really what could be a very significant growth path. And the challenge here is to figure out ways to produce the economic growth without causing the environmental harm. I think in the United States, we have been trending this way for a long time, but it's been slow and gradual. We have been moving towards lighter industry. Same thing in China. China's been much less gradual. Just this last year, their tertiary sector, exceeded their secondary sector. So services exceeded manufacturing for the first time. So we are in this pathway, and the challenge, which is pretty exciting, John, is how do we accelerate, the good stuff and slow down the bad stuff and manage that transition for workers and industry?
I'm going to give one other additional answer from the U.S. perspective, which is the President Obama's decision to commit to paper a climate action plan and then have a mechanism to both engage the private sector and drive the whole of government was critical to the success that I think he achieved. And I think that the Indian government is used to and good at planning. And then the question is, do they have the right mechanisms to implement those plans and to drive those plans forward? In the back?
First, thanks very much for the comments. My name is Tom Hazlett. I'm curious, in your deliberations, the spark of citizen scientists is really interesting. In the financing side of the conversations, have you considered or explored the possibilities of leveraging what I presume is a small land holding structure for the agrarian sector, together with the banking system, which is from my perspective, pretty heavily overdeveloped to serve the rural communities. India stands as a watershed country with respect to microfinance, and I'm just curious if you've considered what I'm going to call the small unit size financing for some of the innovation and the ideation that you've talked about.
I must raise that, but anybody want to take that from Indian side?
Sure. So let me give you an example from a southern state in India called Andhra Pradesh. About 3.5 years ago, they decided to start experimenting with a program called zero budget natural farming. The natural farming part is eliminating chemical pesticides and fertilizers. You're using natural inoculants to treat the soil, increase aeration of the soil, as well as treat the seeds. The zero budget part was, can I do this at about 1/10 the normal input costs for the small marginal farmer, right? So in the last 3.5 years, what they managed to do is scale it out to about 350,000 farmers across all districts in Andhra Pradesh. In last June, the Chief Minister of the state stood in front of 8,000 farmers and said, by 2024, all 6 million farmers in the state will shift to zero budget natural farming. This is the world's largest experiment at that scale. Now, why am I using this as an example? Is because of the financing story here. There's state government funding coming in terms of training what are called the master farmers. In each block, a block is a group of villages. In each block, there are master farmers being trained who then go and train farmers in the villages, as well as providing some of the initial kind of capital for moving the farmer towards these new inoculants. But there is private capital coming in the form of BNP Paribas and others, up to about $2.5 billion investment that they've committed, that they think that they can co-finance with the state government. And the third part here, which goes back to the microfinance example, Andhra Pradesh has a very long history of women-led self-help groups and microfinance institutions. Now, on the back of that experience, men started forming their own self-help groups. So in the summer when I was with the Chief Minister in the villages, it was very interesting. In a small hall like this in the village, the women would be making a PowerPoint presentation on a wall. There's no screen or anything. And then the men would start projecting their presentation on the other side, right? So they realized that this kind of leveraging the social capital of what you already have experienced in terms of microfinancing for other purposes could now bring in the men who are sort of the owners of the land. Even though the women are tilling, unfortunately, the men own the land. So they say, we are going to form our own self-help groups. And that then creates a new kind of suction or demand for new finance being generated. So state, government capital, private capital, large institutional investment, and microfinance coming together for a big experiment at scale. Even if it fails, it will yield some results for us, lessons for us.
Grab the mic.
My name is Russell Seitz. I go back to the epoch in which it was necessary for Republicans to persuade Ronald Reagan to embrace the Montreal Protocol. Since then, we've all witnessed an increasing polarization of perceptions of climate science to the degree that the subject is anathema amongst the Republican base, as much as it is an object of advocacy by the Center for American Progress. Now, Bill Reilly can testify that there was a time in which bipartisan science policy was regarded as normative, and in which you could find people to talk to at OSTP or the AAAS, regardless of what party you belong to. Now, unfortunately, that is no longer so conspicuously the case. And climate policy doesn't happen in a vacuum. I find it impossible to engage my Republican brethren on the subject, not just because the climate deniers have been vilifying climate science, but because some of John's people have been
Vilifying the Republicans.
making me and other climate Republican climate scientists the objects of opposition research. Now, I don't mind being called.
Not you personally.
I know, but I don't mind being called a troglodyte, but it happened. When we get to the international level, the question in my mind arises, how are we going to do this for the next 2 years, roughly speaking, in the policy vacuum created by the anathemization of science by the Republicans, and when the Democrats won't talk to them either? That said, I'm very intrigued by what's been said about India, both in terms of the utilitarian emphasis on the fact that air conditioning is going to happen because climate change is happening regardless of the rate. But in that context, what is India doing about the less well-popularized aspects of the problem, specifically the urban heating effects that are exacerbating the demand for air conditioning, and since John mentioned carbon black as a low-profile villain in radiative forcing, by the lack of attention to the human albedo footprint, both urban and rural. We make our roofs brighter, which makes our cities cooler, but carbon black settles over land and water alike. I don't see anything being done to engage on the issue of the human albedo footprint.
We want to grab the
I can play with the Republican piece.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, and then I'll come.
And Bill is in a fair position to correct me, but I consider George Shultz amongst my mentors, and I don't think George's characterization of taking the Montreal Protocol to Reagan, with whom he had the backing to negotiate it, was a big lift. I think he actually got direction from Reagan to execute. So it wasn't sort of how do you compel or convince a conservative to do the right thing on science. It was a question, I think, as you say, of a different era when people were competing for the best ideas of how to problem solve. Yeah. Yeah. Now, I would go on to say that a lot of what you just said could have easily been said when I was the climate negotiator for George W. Bush. And everybody sort of say that, look, this guy hates the earth and eats his children, and he's horrible, and will never do anything again because he doesn't want the Kyoto Protocol, and of course that means he's anti-climate. And I think generally today there's a bit of a consensus that we all needed to get beyond the Kyoto Protocol to get to Paris, right? But as my mentor George Shultz says, that probably Bush didn't need to reject it with such flourish, and so in that environment. We were competing for ideas, for better or for worse, but there was always a constant and chronic dialogue about best efforts, irrespective, and ideology was not the driver. The difference, and I think just on this stage, you're representing the past 5 administrations of experience across Republican and Democrat, and the difference is that we now have a president who I don't even think has a scientist in the White House or an OSTP of
Just got one.
Just happened.
Can't wait to hear who that is. But
Hearsay.
Actually a respected meteorologist.
Okay.
Yes.
One for the good
job,
guys.
too.
So I mean, so just that we're 2 years into it without a scientist. We have no, science complex so we've abdicated rationalism is what's happened. This has nothing to do with sort of core political competition of ideas. This is an abdication of rational. How stupid can we be to celebrate it in search of a base? And so that's, I think you're pointing to is an unusual thing. I don't actually attribute that at all to GOP politics. I think there's another thing going on in the body politic that is undermining our parties in general, and the GOP is the first to suffer this massive implosion from these terrible problems. And Trump is as much a symptom as a cause in those things. So I don't also know whether the current construct will return to that, but I do know that thinking people and universities and epicenters and exchanges of knowledge have to be vigilant, because irrespective of what party is in power at any given time, we will lose our democracy if we are not educating on a baseline and celebrating truth and knowledge. That's what this administration has undermined.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would just add, one or 2 points. One is the sclerosis of respect for science and understanding and appreciation of it really began, took its most serious turn with the Gingrich Congress, who, so unlike the present Congress, which seems by default to support the president no matter where he goes. Even the former trade representative, Senator Portman, voted against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They support their president. That was not true when Gingrich got to the House. He did not really support President Bush. Carbon tax, he didn't, or a fuel tax, he didn't support. Gas tax, didn't support the budget agreement. At any rate, that changed, and it was essentially an ideological appeal that worked for Gingrich and worked for getting the majority in the House, and seemed to be something that was worth doing. I have had the experience, and I brought it up recently in an article in a Jesuit magazine, of going to church and never hearing words mentioned that it seems to me might be. The church, Catholic Church, has a very good record on immigration. You don't hear about it from the pulpit. You don't hear about climate, you don't hear about the environment. And the Pope has written an encyclical on this very subject. And so I've asked several pastors, well, why is it? They've been quite frank to say, if you mention any one of 3 words, those 3 words, half your congregation looks up and thinks, oh, you're one of those guys. You're with them. So that's where the country is. And just to take the point that Andy made, that it's a larger problem than the political one. But I was looking for a way to inject some hopeful note in this otherwise depressing conversation. And I'll tell you what it is. It's that the United States did behave at the COP at Katowice. The United States did issue the report on the state of climate and its future impacts in the United States. If you look at the difference between the budget proposals, which would have gutted EPA, both in terms of staffing and also in terms of budget, the Congress quietly crossed them out, actually didn't do it. And substantial funding has continued to causes and to activities that otherwise one might have expected this administration to have killed. I mean, it's, you know, it may sound like small beer, but it's very important that that has been happening. So there are forces in the Congress with whom we disagree on climate who nevertheless are part of an effort to protect the integrity of certain of our institutions and activities.
And if I could just add real quick, I mean, I think one of the most hopeful things has been there has been steady bipartisan support for energy technology innovation. Mm-hmm. In fact, you know, the Congress has completely rejected Trump's budget requests, which would have completely gutted, you know, the U.S. energy RD&D budget. And so that's actually really good news. I mean, we should be increasing it a lot more than we are.
Lamar Alexander, who's leaving the Senate, had a lot to do with that, but that's right.
I will give you one more piece of good news, and notwithstanding the fact that California has replaced Massachusetts as the weirdest state in the country from the perspective of people particularly living in red states, I saw a little bit of Marty Walsh's State of the City, and after talking at the front end about climate change and being a challenge of climate change, towards the back end, he said, I'm going to Washington after talking about its dysfunctionality, and I'm going with Charlie Baker. And we're going to present a united front in Congress to what needs to happen to make our state and our city great. I think modeling more of that kind of behavior is actually really quite a good thing to do. We'll take one last question, then the quiz question.
Hi, my name is Abhijit. I work in the clean tech space here. Prior to this, I was working in India in a power company. So seen a good and bad of both worlds. My question is really, are we overemphasizing the importance of Delhi and Washington, D.C. in the whole climate bilateral work and discussion? Because you know, it's not the first time we've had a policy vacuum. The U.S. never ratified the Kyoto. A lot of clean energy projects still did happen in India. And even post-Kyoto, most of the private sector that came in was basically between private sector participation, the GE or the First Solar, and the Indian companies. So, Mike, I think I have a two-pronged question here. One is, you also see in 2018, 2019, a larger role of the private sector, both from finance as well as technology side, in penetrating and helping India become cleaner, A, from the US standpoint? Secondly, do you also see an environment for the next possible 2 to 5 years where we can still do as much clean green stuff without absolutely any involvement? Because India's going to get into elections this year. We never know what's going to happen there. We've had a good last 4 or 5 years. I'm just kind of putting it out to the audience more on a generic basis about the private sector participation.
Get Anil and Jamshyd to react to that a little bit.
Well, I think if you look at the Indian scenario, particularly in the context of energy, it's a problem of a much higher dimension, simply because it's not just a question of decarbonizing the existing energy system. Our energy system may have to go maybe 4 times, 5 times bigger than what it is to cater to the needs. And that's actually an issue of investment. So we need to have a strategy where growth, a very fast and very large growth, takes place alongside the greener objective. And I think there are, apart from finance, there are also issues as to how the money is deployed, and it's not as if a single strategy will work for the whole country. And you need to look at this problem in a somewhat disaggregated way. That's how I look at it.
Jamshyd?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Basically, nobody in India knew very much about green buildings. Okay, 10 years ago, we started this program based on the US experience of how to go about building certified green buildings and how to encourage the building industry to actually move in that direction. And over these last 10 years, what we've achieved from that is that we have the second largest stock of certified green buildings in the world after the US. So I think the thing is, if you pick on a particular area that, green buildings have multiple benefits, not just for raw materials, but, also for the people who work in it and all that sort of thing. So you've got to find these type of projects that are good for the economy, good for the people, from the business point of view, and really will make a shift in the narrative in the way that development is done.
Okay, lightning round. Most excited. What are you most excited about for the next few years?
I'm most excited about nano manufacturing. Wow, that's off left base. But we've exited the industrial age. We still have climate negotiations, policies, and discussions like we're in it. We're in the information age. That's about an era where every device, every appliance in our physical world is not just an iPhone, but our toaster or our thermostat or our cars are going to be Wi-Fi connected and IP addressable and either consuming, producing, or storing energy. And that means at the heart of that, how are we managing that energy in a connected, ubiquitous Internet of Things? And that means we need to understand at the nano level how we can design thermal efficiency in the fastest growing source of energy consumption, data consumption. And it means that we can use nano manufacturing to design a 10x improvement in battery storage so that we can get off of carbon and fossil fuels.
It's good. Good start. Arunabha?
Just 3 agricultural activities: pesticide spraying, rice transplanting, harvesting. Using clean energy is a $40 billion opportunity in India. 14 non-farm activities in the rural economy using clean energy is a $13 billion opportunity in India. What I'm really excited about is if we can use the most advanced clean energy technologies and use it for income-generating activities in the rural economy, then you are really changing the narrative altogether of what will drive the next phase of growth.
Kelly?
Well, I'm a policy geek, so I am really excited about policy implementation. And the reason is there's actually a huge amount of policy experimentation that's happening all over the world on climate change right now. And our climate policy lab at Fletcher is working on trying to understand which of these climate policies work, which don't, and why. And there's just a lot to do, and there's no reason to wait. And so I'm excited to work on getting stuff done right now.
Yeah. Well, actually, one of the things that I mentioned earlier was, I'm really excited about the future of microprocessors for cooling. I think that these thermochips, there's not much scientific work and development and real interest in materials and everything that goes into make them efficiency. And my ambition is to make them more efficient than a compressor-based cooling system. And I think from whatever I've seen, I think that's entirely possible based on the science on it. And I hope that can then revolutionize cooling and heating throughout the world.
Bill? I think a really great cause of hope to me is the activation and energizing of millennials. There are many in this audience here, and there's some 12 million millennials who have never voted. They say they voted. They believe probably that they have voted. They believe it is a civic obligation to vote, but the record shows, and these are public records, that they never have. Pew has done an analysis of attitudes in different cohorts and will actually show you what the top issues of concern to people are. And for the country, the environment is distressingly low. It's in the lower 8, 9, or 10 or so. People don't vote the environment, basically, or climate. However, the polls show that a very significant number of those 12 million rank environment or climate number 1 or number 2. So there is a group called the Environmental Voter Project, which targets those voters. They already know that the people they're talking to have listed climate or the environment in the top 2. They touch them 5 times. They talk to them. They have conversations where they get them to promise to make a commitment, a signed commitment to vote in the next election, even if it's for the school board, just to kind of get in the habit so that they do learn how to do it. They get in touch with them before registration, and they ask them, have you registered? And here's how you register. And then finally, they don't take a position. They don't endorse anybody in these elections. And their research, some of which was done in this state, shows that they can increase by 2 to 4% turnout. And the turnout at that level, as you know, in so many close elections in the United States, is a very big deal. And I think it could change the complexion of politics in the United States and change the approach to some of these issues. One of the interesting things about it is even if they do not succeed in affecting the election, they do something that from a political point of view is very important. Politicians see that people are not interested in these issues in their constituencies, and so they don't talk about them and they don't think they have to have positions that respond to them. Yeah. But once they see that people have registered and those are the issues of concern, because they'll be polling them, they will decide next time, I've got to have answers. The part of my constituency that does vote these issues cares and is watching what I'm doing. So I think this is a very promising development, and it's something that how millennials can really use a lot of the energy, and I think we owe some of it to Trump, as someone said today. Well, more power to him in that respect. Let's help him mobilize the rest of us.
That's called praising with faint damnation. Anil?
India, even today, around 2/3 of the population lives in villages. And so the larger segment of Indians would be in villages at least for a few more decades. Average income, household income in villages is roughly half of average urban income. So there is a huge divide. So for me, carrying out or promoting rural development which leverages today's knowledge, because it's only by leveraging today's knowledge that you can bridge this gap and also take villages beyond the classical agriculture or agro-produce value addition. I see no reason why villages cannot participate in manufacture, why they can't participate in service sector. The gap there is we have to make them knowledge empowered. And that, to my mind, is something which the new era actually enables us to do. It's an opportunity. And sooner we bridge the gap, better it would be. Otherwise, I see problems.
Okay, so I will close it out with a couple of points and then what I'm excited about, which is that the two of the top 10 interventions that could bend the curve on climate change and get us going below 2.0 and down to 1.5 are universal access to family planning and full implementation of the gender equity SDG challenge. And what I'm optimistic about is after the 2018 elections, we actually have some policymakers who might actually understand that point. So thank you all for coming out and hanging out with us. And I hope you take an interest both in not just the climate and energy dialogue, but the U.S.-India relationship, and look to India as a source of inspiration for action in the future. So thank you all for being here.